John Spong was at an MCC conference in Phoenix, Arizona, more years ago than I like to remember. And I heard him speak at that conference, and in a refreshing new way that I'd not heard before, particularly from an Episcopal bishop. And I rushed out and I bought the first book of his that I read, Homosexuality, Not a Sin, Not a Sickness. No, Living in Sin. Sorry, Living in Sin. And I read it from cover to cover. And then I read Rescuing the Bible from Fundamentalism. And I've heard since those days John speak many, many times, always with a passion for justice, a passion for God's love, and a passion for all of God's people. And it's with great deal of pleasure and honour and very large amount of humility that I invite Bishop John Spong to our pulpit this evening.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to be with Greg. The reason I accepted his invitation was that when he called, it was 1:30 in America, and I was too sleepy to know what I was saying. He doesn't quite understand the difference between Australian time and American time, but I was still honored. I'm glad to be in the MCC Church. I have a great affection for Troy Perry, who is the founder of this tradition. There's a sense in which I wish it had not needed to be founded. That is, I wish that gay and lesbian people could have found the welcome of Christ in the tradition of their births. But that is not the way life goes. And I must say I'm particularly pleased to be in Sydney because my sense is that the dominant religious mentalities of Sydney are not very open to many of God's people. I must say I love the singing. Thank you for that. It's very different from the kind of music we get in my church. You know, the Bible suggests that the Jews are God's chosen people, and history suggests that the Anglicans are God's frozen people. I think you could liven them up just a little bit. Someone said the Anglican Church is no place to get religion. We live in a rather fascinating time, religiously speaking, and in terms of the issues of justice for gay and lesbian people. In the Western Christian churches, there has been an enormous debate going on for about 30 years. Most of it underneath the surface, but some of it on the surface and quite overt and quite conscious. And we've seen step by step as a new consciousness begins to embrace Christian people that enables them to see the gifts of gay and lesbian people from a very different perspective. It was in 1992 in my church in the United States that the first out-of-the-closet lesbian was ordained to the priesthood despite the fact that she was living in a partnered relationship. It was in 1989 that the first gay man was ordained who was openly in a committed relationship. His name was Robert Williams, and I was the bishop who ordained him. It was an enormous struggle with great hostility, but the fact is that consciousness is growing. In the last year, inside my communion, there has been a gay man appointed to be a bishop in the Anglican Church in England with the full consent of the Archbishop of Canterbury. But when enormous hostility erupted from evangelical and Catholic circles, the Archbishop of Canterbury lost his nerve and forced this man to resign from that appointment. But then in the United States, a man named Eugene Robinson, who has been living in a committed relationship with his partner for 14 years, was elected to be the Episcopal or Anglican Bishop of New Hampshire. And at the General Convention of the Episcopal Church just this past month, he was confirmed in that election by 60% of the vote of the bishops, 75% of the vote of the clergy, and 80% of the vote of the laity. It is really very difficult if you have elected and confirmed a gay man living in a committed relationship to be one of the bishops of the church, that it is very unlikely that you can continue to treat gay and lesbian people as if they are second-class citizens. It was an enormous step forward. Now, of course, it creates negative reactions. So we have a little group, and they get a lot of press, a little group meeting in Plano, Texas to protest. Folks, if a group has to meet in Plano, Texas, it's not terribly significant. And it is sort of chaired by the Episcopal or Anglican Bishop of Pittsburgh, and I know him quite well, and he is not a leader of anything. If he is the leadership of this group, it is a very insignificant group. But what they do, as always, is to suggest that anybody that disagrees with them disagrees with God and disagrees with the Bible. The Bible, they say, clearly teaches that homosexuality is evil. Well, I'd like to examine that claim tonight, and I'd like to examine it quite publicly. I think if people are going to quote the Bible as a weapon to be used to oppress human beings, they jolly well better read it. And they better understand what it is they're reading, because they're leaning on an incredibly weak read. The fact is, the Bible was quoted in the 13th century to oppose the Magna Carta and to support the divine right of kings. I look around the world today and I don't see anybody who rules by divine right. Certainly Prince Charles of England, if he rules at all, will be by the consent of the people and by the consent of Parliament. The divine right of kings is an idea that has died. Of course, the Bible was quoted in the 17th century to condemn Galileo and to prove that the earth was the center of the universe. Even the Vatican issued a report in 1991 that said, we now think Galileo was right. Well, he jolly well better have been right, because space travel's been going on for 50 years, and you can't be doing space travel if Galileo wasn't right. So it's always good to see the church become relevant, even if it's 400 years too late. And of course the Bible was quoted in the 18th century to uphold the institution of slavery. Did you know that the Pope has owned slaves in Christian history? And the Bible was quoted to uphold that. And the Bible was quoted time and time again to prove that women were not created in the image of God, that only men bore the divine image, so therefore women didn't have to be educated, women didn't have to vote. All women had to do was to serve the men in their lives. And that the Bible quoted over and over again. Women didn't get to vote in this country and in my country until the early years of the 20th century. And then, of course, we quoted the Bible to prove that homosexual people were somehow mentally sick or morally depraved or lacking in any of the graces that would enable them to be called the children of God. And guess which parts of the Bible they quoted? There are only 7 places that they could possibly quote. 3 of them are in what we call the later Pauline or even pseudo-Pauline material of the Bible. That is, those epistles of Paul that were really not written by Paul, written by some of Paul's disciples long after Paul was dead, but they wanted to give them authority, and so they said, Paul has written this. And those 3 are interestingly enough, quite problematic and quite suspect. Indeed, it looks like, if you go back and read the original Greek, that the words being used probably referred to temple prostitutes and not to homosexual people. So there's some suspicion that the text had been twisted a bit to guarantee the prejudices. But if you take those 3 away, and I can't speak on all 7 or we'd be here at midnight, if you take those 3 away, it leaves us with 4 basic biblical texts that are said to condemn the sin of homosexuality. I want to look at them briefly.